a lot with my co-researcher, my co-author, Marie Charles, of classroom-based research. And very often when I leave a lesson or I'm having a cup of tea in the staff room, the teacher who has been kind enough, let's never forget that, kind enough to allow us into the classroom will say, "Bill, what do you think?" And I'll say, because one tries to be polite, because one is a guest, but you didn't need the child. And they look at me in puzzlement, as if to say, "Well, what's wrong with this one? Has he been sitting there in a trance?" Well, you didn't need the child because you took no notice of the learning that was emerging during that lesson. It was packaged, it was pre-planned, it got you from A to C. You did your 40 minutes, your hour, and you did not deviate. So why bother to have the child? Write up the notes, put them on the server so the parent can see what's happening in the school. Share the photocopiable planning notes from teacher to teacher. It makes perfect sense to me, but it's so lazy. And surely we're entitled to expect more from our teachers. But in England, we have a one-size-fits-all teacher training model. So if the teacher training model expects conformity, these young people, and sometimes not so young people who've decided to come back into the profession from another career, who can blame them if they think it's all about the three-part lesson, getting from A to C, always making sure that B is there? Concerns. We're not machines. Children aren't machines. Children are complex beings. So why is our pedagogy not reflecting that? It's not reflecting it because it doesn't need to reflect it. Because the metric that they, we, us, aren't we here for an assessment conference? Don't we have a voice in our national assessment systems? Don't you get annoyed, like what I do, that we're condoning this one-size-fits-all pedagogy, conforming to the norms of the metric? The metric has been allowed to rule, and you, my friends, have the power to challenge or to condone that metric. Now, to some of you, the metric is very suited because we make nice careers out of it. We make nice businesses out of it. But is that assessment for future generations? Is that what we're going to be proud to leave as a legacy? Let's just digress and do a little bit of a canter around a little bit of literature for a few moments. I quite like the title, Equity Pedagogy. It was coined by an American researcher called James Banks. I was privileged to meet James at a conference that actually Mark and I were at as part of a World Bank project that we're working on in Russia at the moment. And I know exactly what James is talking about there. He's reflecting the thoughts again of another thinker, Philippe Perroneau, that very straightforward formula that you can actually see on the overhead at the moment. So simple, but apparently so confusing. Let me just change it slightly. Children do not have the same abilities, nor do they have the same way of working. An optimal learning situation for one child will not be an optimal learning situation for another. Diversity in children requires appropriate treatment for each. Therefore, we need diversity of approach. To me, it couldn't be simpler, but it gets reduced to, let's set them. Some great work by Joanne Boyle, who's done some really good research on the iniquity of setting, that children can be set as early as 6 or 7 and still be in that same setting band when they're 15 or 16. How did that lesson go, Bill? You don't need the children. Is the message becoming clearer? We're reducing. Let's think about Cornell West. Again, another American researcher, philosopher, speaker, and believer. Stereotypes cut deep. Don't get caught in the narrow categories. People are complex. Pause is deliberate. Again, the originator of the testocracy term, which I have gladly, with acknowledgement, purloined, Lana Gurnier, another American thinker, struggler, a real fighter. There might be something wrong with the metric, not with the groups that we're measuring. Don't blame the child. Don't label. Don't fall back on stereotypes as an excuse for allowing educational pornography to be perpetuated. Limitations of the testocracy. You'll know this one off by heart. I could actually just leave you to read it. We know that tests are arbitrary. We know they're exclusionary. We know that what we're actually doing is reinforcing socio-economic norms, reinforcing elitism. No matter how poor it is, and this comes to the nub of one of the politicians' questions, no matter how variable it is, local teacher assessment excludes fewer pupils from those lower socio-economic strata than does reliance on test scores. You don't need a research project to prove that. The last 25 years in England have proved it. Here's a nice one. We've just had the A+ grade, first ever A-level results in England. They were hitting the press as I was leaving Manchester this week. Independent schools provide 14% of the entries. Independent schools provide 30% of the A-star grades awarded. This is England's version of a meritocracy, in which wealthy, middle-income parents can buy the next generation's success. We're here at a conference that's talking about assessment for the next generation. Unless we start to understand the extent of the term assessment, very quickly, the next 20 years are going to be worse than the previous 20 years. Assessment has to include rich teaching and learning. It has to include a pedagogy with the complexity of the child at the center. It must no longer narrow the curriculum. Some of you will remember that after a 10-year study for our national government, again working with another good friend of this conference, Colin Robinson, Joe Bragg and myself published a few seminal papers that showed the huge reduction in the primary curriculum in England that had been brought about by the testing culture. The data's there, it's been rigorously analysed and vetted. It demonstrates what can happen if you allow politicians to run wild. Assessment, as currently defined, is the biggest negative factor in social mobility. We label, we label,